High on Life is a comedy action game described by the devs as Blade Runner meets the Muppets, which, most interestingly, shares a lot of its DNA with Metroid Prime, as more specifically, the gameplay is an FPS Metroidvania platformer. As such, the game naturally makes good use of rewarding exploration at different stages of the game by teasing loot in different areas that are locked away until the player has the necessary items or equipment to unlock them. However, from there, the game quickly goes off the rails, possibly on purpose, but off the rails nonetheless. While the game does provide you a ping system that highlights useful objects and presents a marker on your HUD to guide you, the game also relentlessly nags the player about what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go, oftentimes condescendingly. Characters will frequently mock the player for not doing what they wanted you to do immediately, or otherwise not completing a task quickly enough, and this occurs at nearly every possible opportunity. This indirectly punishes the player for playing at their own pace and for exploring the area as they gain access to it. Likewise, this is at odds with the Metroidvania nature of the game, as the characters in the universe and the game's treatment of the player come into conflict with what the gameplay actually incentivizes players to do. And while the game does take steps to engage players in the longer term by showing them exactly how to achieve many side goals, such as the bounty messages or the lug loxes for each area, the game also has a pretty egregious problem with its pacing. Everything comes to a grinding halt the moment that the player comes back from a mission, and is then forced to both sit through and participate in dialogue between Jean, Lizzie, and sometimes even the combination of guns that you find before being allowed to progress or leave the house in any way. This sometimes even happens mid-mission, and while the outcomes of some of these conversations can be hilarious, it also makes these jokes at the cost of holding the player hostage until either they laugh or stop caring. The level design is split amongst several playable areas, all on 3 different worlds, not counting Earth. Of the 3, 2 are mostly the same, with the caveat of where you start, with both of them being vaguely sci-fi cities with different versions of slums, and one of them is significantly different, which takes place in a giant forested area riddled with underground mines. The difference in spawn location between the 2 city-based planets is that the second one will initially spawn you in a barren desert, a la Dune with the giant sandworms, that eventually gives way to what resembles an old western town, until you finally can get underground to the city that you're going to be spending most of your time in. Overall, the level design is simply fine. Nothing exceptional or awful is to be found, it's just north of mediocre. One place I do want to draw attention to, though, is where it actually shines, which is the various elements of the terrain that are interactable with different traversal mechanics. These elements being things like metal-plated walls, giant super hornets that are actually grapple points, zip lines, impactable platforms that can change in orientation, and flying trucks that quickly fly by certain areas and can be used for platforming. I'll go into much more detail with all of them in the mechanics section, but I wanted to ensure that credit was given here where it was due. What's unfortunate is how poorly the boundaries of the levels were made, or more specifically, how the devs didn't account well enough for the freedom that they give players and how they can move around. There were several instances where I found myself soft-locked because I had the freedom to leave an area in the way that devs didn't account for, and when I tried to die and reset myself, I'd simply respawn in the place that I was last standing, leaving me indefinitely stranded where I landed until I reset the game. The second time that this happened, of the several, was shortly after defeating Douglas and obtaining Squeezy. After leaving the boss arena, Squeezy will ask you if you want to kill these grunts. I didn't want to, I just wanted to move on and get on to the next bounty, so I went past them and tried to platform my way back to the main area. However, what I didn't realize is that Squeezy wasn't actually asking, and that those enemies are required as an encounter to progress the game, as without killing them and the following waves that they summon, the truck that you need to use as a platform to get back never spawns. So I just had to very slowly pick them off from where I got stranded until the game gave me permission to leave. High on Life is one of those games that is so broken in some ways that it can actually make the experience more fun. The easiest example being that the ragdoll physics of dead enemies bug out constantly, either sending bodies flying or causing them to undulate and nod their heads every time that they're shot again. Possibly the most significant glitch that I managed to find in the game is the elevator to Dregtown, where after pushing the button to move the elevator back up to the surface, the elevator would do nothing and I could still leave. However, the game state had quietly changed to assume that I should be in the next area, so Dregtown itself completely unloaded and despawned, allowing me to get out of the map once I later unlocked the jetpack. This is a repeatable glitch, by the way. This happened multiple times and I was able to replicate it on purpose. Less fun, however, are the crashes, the harsh stutters when loading in new areas, the terrible respawns that contribute to the aforementioned soft locking problem, the objective ping system sometimes just outright not working and leading you in circles, and possibly the single most consistent and annoying glitch in the game, mods unloading from your guns, specifically with Squeezy. Very frequently, her mod just wouldn't register, and when I would bring her out, she would be her default color with no special abilities. Meanwhile, if I looked into the menu, her mods were still equipped, and then after checking the menu and seeing that, putting the menu down would suddenly have her with them again. While the glitches can be fun, it never excuses poor programming, nor the fact that you would have to be high to not notice the glitches in High on Life. Hey! Do you like these kinds of analytical reviews? If so, subscribe and hit the bell. It helps me grow and you get more of what you like. It's a win-win. And of course, more spoilers from this point forward. The narrative of High on Life could best be described as comedic set dressing, less of an actual plot and more of an excuse for action and jokes to happen. After being pulled away from a game that you were playing, your nameless, voiceless, genderless, and outside of this one singular moment, faceless character leaves to go shopping with their sister when aliens suddenly invade. This is revealed to be the G3 drug cartel led by Garmantuous once you loot a living gun alien named Kenny off of a corpse of another alien. Kenny uses a teleportation kit stolen from a G3 base to teleport you, your sister Lizzie, and your house to Glim City, where you meet Gene, a washed-up ex-bounty hunter and conman who enables your hunt of the G3. You and Kenny then set out to take down the leaders of the G3 one by one until eventually you can kill Garmantuous and get the G3 off of Earth. The end. In the meantime, you also set about liberating the various planets you visit on your hunts from the G3 occupation, and there is a major side plot about why there are almost no other Gatlians other than Kenny and the handful of others that are being wielded by the bosses. Also, in what is possibly the deepest part of the game, each of the main characters go through some form of character arc. Lizzie has a rebellious dating phase that peaks with her becoming a homicidal sadist and murdering her boyfriend who is actually a kidnapper. Gene slowly begins to care about someone other than himself and declares himself to be your new dad, and Kenny comes around to confessing his dark history that serves as his motivation to you in an Applebee's. No, literally just in an Applebee's. Like, seriously, they dropped the whole space Applebee's thing once you go inside. I got chicken quesadillas and pepper steak and everything, which I will admit was very funny. Though the main problem with all of these arcs and characters is that none of them actually change anything about the world, your motivation, or their behavior towards you. Gene was always enabling your bounty hunting regardless of whether or not he believed in you or expected you to survive. The only difference is his motive. At first, he enabled you to go on more and more dangerous missions in the hopes that you would die and he could steal your house. And now he continues to enable you in the hopes simply that you don't die. Lizzie didn't even need to be in the game at all for what it matters. She contributes nothing to the overall narrative except for derailing it entirely and distracting from the one time that the game's story tried to take itself seriously with the revelation of Kenny's backstory. Your player character doesn't even have a character. Kenny does 90% of all the talking for you to the point that it's very weird when he's not present and you choose a dialogue option and there's simply no talking. You don't even have a reason to be personally invested in this situation either. The G3 are attacking and harvesting Earth as a whole, not just your neighborhood. Jumping to threatening all of humanity causes the stakes to become abstract and impersonal. They don't have your friends. They don't have your sister. They don't even have your parents, and heck, you don't even see your parents until a picture in the end credits confirms that they're actually alive. Even worse, nothing you do has any consequence aside from slightly different dialogue, with arguably the exception of Globo, this butt-faced kid who gains fame and moves some NPCs around after you buy him a drum to play. Possibly the most significant, lasting change is the dialogue of the two gatekeepers of the slums of Glim City, who will either love or hate you for the rest of the entire game based on your initial conversation with them. Those aside, though, the world doesn't change in any meaningful way to reflect the decisions that you've made or the people that you've killed. Even with Kenny's story, which I would argue is the most important piece of world building in the story, the way the player learns about this and interacts with it is purely by not interacting with it at all and being fed more exposition than food in that aforementioned Applebee's. Almost the entire game is like this. It always tells and never shows, and even the one time that it does choose to show, being the one time that you go to the ruined remains of Gatlis, the Gatlian homeworld, you've already been told everything about it, so the reveal doesn't come as any sort of surprise other than to the guns themselves. This whole interaction, even if you were to leave the exposition unchanged, could have been significantly improved if the reveal of Gatlas came before Kenny explains his backstory. That way the player and the characters alike are left questioning what this unknown planet is, and why Kenny's first instinct when fleeing the G3 was to take you here. The characters and guns would begin asking questions, and Kenny would begin to crack and reveal that he's been hiding something from both you and the other guns this entire time. Cue the exposition dump we got at the Applebee's, except now it carries some level of narrative weight, instead of being played off as some kind of awkward breakup date. Mechanically, the game seems to take a lot of inspiration from good places, most notably Halo, Doom, and even Vanquish. And this isn't a joke about the intro section that's literally just a parody of Doom, Wolfenstein, and Splinter Cell for some reason. I mean Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal Doom. Doom no longer sounds like a word. Doom. For Traversal, the player unlocks several abilities for their suit, and sometimes direct upgrades for them, which both directly affect what types of terrain can be traversed and how quickly the player can get around in general. The player first gets a quick lateral dash, and later can upgrade it into a long, fast knee slide a la Vanquish, which becomes the fastest way of getting around. Then the player finds Knifey, who in addition to being a massively homicidal hematophile and a knife, is also a grappling hook, which allows players to both swing off of all the large wasp-like hook bugs flying around and grapple to magnetically charged ledges. Next, the player unlocks the mag boots, which allows them to walk on walls that have exposed metal plates or metallic ore, and lastly, the player unlocks the aforementioned jetpack, which, need I say more? It's a jetpack. It lets you temporarily fly, gain height, and cover large distances that you couldn't on foot. The combination of sliding, swinging, walking on walls, and literally flying around ensures that movement is quick, generally fluid, and constantly changing, which both gives players the freedom to finesse their way through tight situations, and the devs freedom to experiment with a wide variety of terrain and platforming opportunities. There's even a skate park parody of the Tony Hawk games where all you try to do is chain every movement option you have to gain the most points possible for a reward. For the combat, the player progressively unlocks more Gatlians, a sentient alien species that also function as living weapons. All Gatlians have a default firing mode, which typically changes when aiming down sights, and an alt fire mode that provides various utilities with their trick hole. And also Knifey, who doesn't want to be forgotten.
And I'm here too! Knifey, your friend! Remember me?
And for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to say ADS from now on instead of aim down sights. Starting with Kenny, he's the default semi-auto pistol who's accurate with an ability to headshot and an alt fire that knocks enemies within a certain radius into the air, allowing for combos. His ADS doesn't change how he functions, and instead just gives a clearer, more accurate targeting reticle. Gus is a shotgun with an ADS ability that sucks enemies towards you in order to guarantee that you land the devastating full spread, and his alt fire shoots a superheated disc, which ricochets around the battlefield hitting multiple enemies, and if it lands near enough to you, can be hit with Knifey to start comboing all over again. Sweezy is where the very clear Halo inspiration comes in, as she is essentially a combination of the Needler and Needle rifle at the same time, but can also stop time. She fires crystals, which, if hit with her ADS fire or Knifey, will combine to create a damaging explosion on enemies. Her ADS fires a single, piercing, long-range crystal like the Needle rifle does, which can penetrate through some walls, and her alt fire shoots off a bubble which slows down time within it for a short duration. The bubble can also be overcharged by shooting her needles into it. Creature is an abomination unto God, but we still love him and he's a sweetheart. He fires out his children, which latch onto enemies and deal damage over time, and his ADS allows you to lob them more precisely. His alt fire sends out a kid with more brain power than the others, yes, that's its actual special ability, allowing it to temporarily mind control any enemy that it latches onto, including most bosses. And lastly, you have Let's Do It, who acts similarly to Doom's Unmaker. After a brief charge up, Let's Do It unleashes a massive sustained barrage of energy beams that arc from enemies and objects, destroying everything in your way. Although you do give him up after the final boss fight, which is somewhat disappointing. Utilizing the movement mechanics in conjunction with managing your different guns' specialties and alt fires, along with the shield and alt fire pickups littered around the map, makes for an excellent frenetic combat experience that uplifts the entire game once it really gets going. The visual and sound design are very sine-wavy topics, with lots of highs and lows. Starting on the visual highs, the game has a very distinct visual style that comes across as Rick and Morty meets Borderlands. It's unmistakably Justin Roiland, while also branching out in a territory that's been proven to work by other successful titles, especially with the stylistic boss introductions. Each of the leaders of the G3 are unique and different species that separate them out from the rest of the NPCs in the game. There's also a surprising amount of attention to detail paid to both the enemies and your house. Most enemies in the game are covered in armor group, which is why the majority of them are all the same color, and the goop will react to the damage that you deal as you fight them. Depending on where you shoot the enemies, the goop will be stripped away, and this obvious difference in visual language of the enemies underneath to the goop on top informs the player on where they are vulnerable, as shooting an area without the goop armor is much more effective. Your house is one of the only parts of the game that will actively change in accordance to how much you've progressed in the game, as Jean will continue to cause damage and clutter the longer you're gone. The body of the G3 minion that Lizzie kills in the opening section will be gone once the house teleports to Glim City, and instead there will be a huge blood trail leading out of the house and the front door. The floors will become more scratched and ruined the more equipment Jean brings in, and the trash and filth will continue to pile up more and more until there are flies everywhere. In one particular instance of both attention to detail and a joke that personally landed for me, your house ends up getting multiple parking tickets from law enforcement that are posted on the walls outside, but once you end up supporting the mayor, the tickets are all taken down and there is now a political advocacy sign for the mayor in your lawn instead. Going downhill from there, however, is the fact that the game looks like it was an early Xbox 360 game or PS3 game in a lot of places. Animation frame rates are randomly inconsistent sometimes, character models have that weird quirk where they hard cut to a death pose once their animations run out, and in particular, anything having to do with running fluids, I say fluids because I think the closest thing we see to running water is actually acid, looks awful. Almost solid and crystalline in the way that it moves. Also, with the exception of the goop armor, NPC models almost never look different based on their interactions with the environment, with the easiest example being this guy who gets covered in what I will very generously call chocolate-flavored demonetization juice, looking exactly the same after the fact. Sound design wise, the guns are all very unique from one another, and the devs did a fantastic job of selling the fact that you aren't generally shooting bullets. Everything sounds a little unsettlingly organic, as it should. Every shot from Kenny sounds like some sort of viscous liquid being fired at high pressure or exploding. Gus vacuuming enemies and attacks toward the player appropriately sounds like someone inhaling harder than humanly possible. And look, I don't want to describe Creature any more than I absolutely have to, but he literally farts out his kids. Although the music in the game sometimes literally just breaks, and the enemy combat BGM will sometimes just play even though everything is dead. Dialogue can be broken and repeated infinitely as long as the player is given agency to trigger it, and sometimes NPC dialogue is oddly quiet, as seemed to be often the case with your Suit OS, and on slightly fewer occasions with Lizzie. The audio that you hear or have heard in any of my videos on this game has always been significantly boosted. I still stand by what I said in my first impressions. High on Life is an experience. What experience that is, though, depends entirely on who you are, not the game. For me, jokes fell flat about twice as often as they ever landed, and personally, one of my biggest pet peeves in life, let alone in my video games, is being nagged and bossed around. I wasn't ever annoyed by the fact that characters never shut up and constantly talk. I never changed anything for the chatter settings, nothing like that. What I was constantly annoyed about is that the game kept barking at me about what to do when it never needed to. There is an objective ping button, so I can check where I need to go whenever, as long as it doesn't break. There's an objective HUD element in the top left corner telling me what to do, and the radar both tells me where enemies are and where all the loot is. Lay off! One of the things I also really struggled with in I guess a more professional capacity playing the game is that the game sometimes seems to be bad on purpose, just to troll people. There's even one point that literally taunts IGN, Kotaku, and Polygon by pointing out some lazy level design and going, "Oh no, now you're going to have to knock us down a point," which, yes, I actually did, because there are some problems with your level design. I guess the point of the joke is to make fun of reviewers for taking games seriously and then showing that the devs don't care what reviews say, but I don't get how game reviewers are the butt of the joke when you're the one openly mocking your game's problems and pointing out the flaws, even to people who aren't reviewing it. You're just making the game look bad to everyone. It almost feels like the approach is, you can't out me for being bad if I out myself first, which just feels tone deaf since it solves literally nothing and just seems like the game is hurting itself in its confusion. So I'm gonna be honest, the shooting was the only real fun part of the game for me. Well, Traversal was fun too, I guess, but the shooting was really good. But that's pretty much it. So my opinion score of this game is like a 3. It gets more fun as you go, but it's just really not worth the slog to play the shooting if the comedy isn't constantly landing for you, and for me, it wasn't, which meant I was sitting through swaths of obnoxious, unskippable dialogue constantly that was keeping me from actually playing the part of the game that I enjoyed. But in any case, enough about what I think. Is the game actually good? If only this game had more than 4 jokes. The 4 being vulgarity purely for the sake of vulgarity and nothing else, constantly fumbling or improving lines, fourth wall breaks, and obscure references, sometimes damningly to better games. Actually pretty often to better games. And Code Lyoko that one time. I remember Code Lyoko. I was the target audience for that joke and I still didn't laugh. Whatever the case, the one thing I can say for sure about High on Life is it's been a trip. Why are you booing me? I'm right.